Good afternoon and welcome to our Grow Native Master class, the Seed Cycle, Native Seed Collection, Stratification, and Propagation with Mike Hoyle. My name is Erica Van Vrinken. I'm the Outreach and Special Projects Coordinator for the Foundation, and I want to thank you all for joining us for this master class today. During the presentation, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section on your screen, and at the end, the Foundation's Executive Director, Carol David, will read those out to Mike. The webinar is being recorded and the link will be shared with all of you tomorrow along with resources mentioned during the presentation and Q&A session. Mike Hoyle is the manager at Missouri Wildflowers Nursery in Brazito, Missouri, where he has worked for 22 years. He oversees daily operations of the nursery as well as seed cleaning and seed and plant production. And now I will turn it over to Mike for the seed cycle.
Hello. I'm Michael Hoyle, as they said. Thank you to Grow Native for everything they do and for letting me share, hopefully, what will be some useful information with you. I got a lot to go through, so let's get started. I think I'm going to start by just kind of giving you a little information about myself. I'm coming to you from Prairie Home, which probably was on the prairie, I would imagine. Not much prairie up here now. But I got into this business kind of as an accident. Before I did this, I farmed in Western Colorado on our family's farm on my mother's side. Her father and mother have a farm in Western Colorado in Montrose. And my uncle married into the family and has been running the farm for a long time, and I farmed with him for many years in the 90s. And what we mostly did was our main crop was pinto beans. So first of all, for this to make sense, you have to understand how pinto beans, we're used to soybeans around here, which are a plant that grows in little bushes. Pinto beans are vining. They grow on the ground. And because of that, wet years tend to be a problem, especially when they're beginning to dry down and you're getting ready to collect the seed. If you have a lot of rain, your beans can get wet. And one year they had a very wet fall, and as the beans were drying down, my uncle had really bad problems with mold, and you can imagine a whole field of moldy beans out there. And of course, this is the myth. I'm sure it didn't happen this way, but in my mind, this is how it happened. But he looks out across the field and he sees one bean that's sticking up, and it's looks good. It has pods on it, and he goes over. He collects the bean seeds, and he brings it back to the farm, and the next year he plants them out, and they breed true, which is something that, if you know about genetics, like it's some mutation that has happened that has made this plant actually have a bean type structure, a bush type structure, as opposed to a vining plant. So he continued to ramp up his production and came up with a bean that we sold, and it was the 101. It was sold through Thunder Mountain Beans, Thunder Mountain Seed Company that's what kind of started me off on the thinking about seeds in my life. I didn't grow up on the farm, but it's something that's that I've been into for a while now. The bean is a plant that most of us understand. You know, in grade school, you take your bean, you soak it, it germinates on the wet paper towel, and you see it. Interestingly, on that pinto bean, you know, there was a mutation. There was a difference in that bean than all the other beans. And one thing that I've really come to understand in working with natives is that's a pretty cool process that happened. I thought that was oh wow, look, this bean was so different. That happens in nature all the time. It's not that big of a deal. Is what happened is my uncle was able to, kind of see it and take advantage of it. And those mutations and those differences from plant to plant, we see in the native world all the time. And it's kind of a miracle. It's just like, it's so cool to see, like in lobelias where you have 50 plants and all of them, look a little bit different from each other in the color of the flower and, how they grow. There's all sorts of interesting differences. And these differences are what make the natural world very resilient. But it also makes it hard to germinate their seeds because they've come up with so many different strategies for keeping their next generation to survive. And we're going to talk about some of those strategies, talk about how to think about how the seed might affect, or how the plant needing to survive might affect how we what we have to do to the seed to make it germinate, and how they grow. Seeds are a fairly new invention for the plants. For most of the times that plants have been on Earth, spores were the main way of passing on your genes. Spores are really just a clone of the plant. And if you've ever tried to grow plants from spores, it's pretty tricky. It's very specific to what they need. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong. I've done it a few times. It's not an easy thing to do. And if you think about nature, you have to have these very specialized areas for different kinds of spores. The nice thing about spores, they do travel. They've found them in the stratosphere. But some of the longest spores will live about 2.5 years before they die. So, they can't hang around for long periods if there's changes in the environment. They'll disappear. Where seeds, seeds have developed in plants, and they have seed coats. They have specialized tannin structures that sit around the seed and keep that dangerous oxygen from rotting the seed, and keeps other pathogens from coming into seed. And humans have germinated seed that was hundreds of years old. They can sit in Missouri grounds for decades, and then all of a sudden the right things happen, and they can start growing again. So as a strategy for survival, it was a really good survival strategy. And as we can tell, it's worked very well because most plants around now produce seeds. The other thing that's really cool about seeds is just the diversity. They're a really neat structure. From the top left one is the celandine poppy. It has little structures that provide food for ants, and the ants can bury the seeds and move them around and provide very good homes for them. Indian paintbrush in the middle. They're incredibly lightweight, small seed. If you know about Indian paintbrush, it's hemisaprophytic. It has to steal some of its energy from plants in order to be healthy, from other plants. So it really is important for it to move around a lot so it can hook up with other plants and steal their nutrients in their water. Pale purple coneflower, can grow in very dry areas, and it's helpful for it. It has high tannic content. The seed can last for years. Same with leatherflower, Fremont's leatherflower. I don't know how to make that germinate well. I've never done a great job. I think it has a very hard dormancy. Most of the clematises will take 2 years to germinate. Same poppy mallows, incredibly hard shell, hard seed coat, tannins, the whole bit. They can take years. In fact, most of our trays of poppy mallows or the Calorose species will keep the trays for up to 3 years because you just continually have plants germinating at all times of the year, spring, summer, winter. In a greenhouse, they germinate in the middle of the winter. Copper iris, another really neat seed that has a very fleshy outside that floats, and when you live in the water, a floating seed is beneficial. Plus the seeds can last years. That's another one that we literally have a bed that I've just been adding seed to year after year after year. And you'll have many year old seeds that'll finally germinate once the outer coat breaks down, and then you get enough moisture in it to start the germination process. And again, just the structure of them is never ending. It's each one's a little different than the next, and all seeds are different from each other. And then you think about like where these seeds come from. They have these containers that hold the seed, and in the case of milkweeds, the container holds it up high so that they can blow around in the fall. Or in some milkweeds actually germinate early or come up early, like spider milkweed takes advantage of the spring winds. And those containers, thinking about how does the seed fit into the container? What happens to, like, one of our favorite containers, of course, is the blackberry. It's one of my favorite containers for seeds. And you have to think those seeds, are going to be eaten by things and often have to go through the digestive tract of whatever's eating them and still survive. And if they can survive through the digestive tract, they might end up in a very fertile place that they can continue their life. Same on the bottom, the wahoo is another fruited seed, which can sometimes take a couple years, which some seed will germinate first year, but often most of your seed will take 2 years before it'll germinate. And on the right, that's the baptisias, which have a very hard seed coat, can sit in the ground for years, and sit in these pods that then hold over the winter in the pod and tumble around and spread their seed. And of course, these seeds all come from flowers. And one thing I kind of want to just mention, because as I've been doing this, we think about, so the plants that we see in our environment are the most successful plants. Something you ought to think about. It's kind of an interesting idea that the most successful plants on Earth now are the plants that humans plant. There are more acres of soybeans and corn and wheat than there are of any other kind of plant. And in the native plant industry, if you think about it, we are taking seed and things from very small, leftover remnant areas, prairies or forests, and we're selling them, and what sells them is often the flower. So in the life cycle, as plants develop, these flowers are really to attract bugs and stuff. But nowadays they attract humans, and humans, along with bugs, are probably one of their, we're one of their biggest spreaders. We spread these plants now further than any other kind of animal. We sell plants, all over the Midwest. And so a seed that might have come from a prairie now can spread all through the Midwest. And so that's another reason why, if you think about your connection to the prairie as a homeowner, you're the number one spreader of these genetics now. So to get started growing plants, you need those flowers, and then you have to wait for the seed to develop. Seed is the starting point and the end point for the plant. Just a general rule of thumb. I'm not going to get too specific on a lot of this stuff because The first time I did this talk, it was over an hour and a half. So I've had to really cut it down. So let's just talk about when to collect. Just a very good general rule of thumb for collecting seed is if the stem is starting to turn brown or black, there's probably no nutrients going back up into these seeds. So the seeds are usually ready at that point to collect. Few species you can collect earlier, which might be beneficial in some cases, but just a good rule of thumb is look at those stems, and if they've started turning brown, it's usually a good time to collect. Once you've collected, drying the seed down so you can get it to a workable stage is usually necessary, unless you can unless it sits on the plant long enough that it really dries down hard and you've got a good seed, which might not, if you're small time, you're just collecting stuff out of your yard, you might immediately be able to process the seed, but once you get up into larger quantities, it usually takes, you have to have a lot of steps to get larger quantities done. And as things sit, you really have to pay attention to mice, because mice can eat your seeds so quickly, and squirrels too in some cases. So think about how can I keep this seed so mice might not get it all. It's something that a lot of people don't think about, and it is amazing how quickly, especially with certain species, prairie dropseed, all your sunflower type plants, mice will love them. One way that we do it is we keep things off the ground, or in buckets, things that make mice may be hard for mice to get to, especially when you have a small quantity. If you have a small quantity of seed, you can lose all of it very quickly. The other thing you need to think about, if you are using plastic or bins and stuff like that, airflow to the seed is always really important. Covering seed up when it's not completely dried is as bad as the mice getting it. You have all sorts of other things, molds, funguses that can get started in the seed and make it so your seed won't germinate later, which can be very frustrating after you've spent time to collect and stuff. It can ruin your day for sure. Seed cleaning. Seed cleaning is a very big topic. I'm just gonna kind of hit some basics. So on the left here, this is our new seed cleaner, Carl. This is one of our smaller seed cleaners. Basically we're separating seed by size using screens, and then with air for weight. The weight of the seed determines lots of times how good the seed is. And so we're blowing air through it will help you separate good and bad seed. On the right here, I have a little machine we've made out of PVC and a little squirrel cage fan. It works really well for smaller amounts. And when we are getting our seed ready, we try to get it as clean as we possibly can. Even what we're selling, we'll go through it and lay it out a lot of times, and take credit or manually take out any weed seeds that we see, because doing it before we have weeds in flats or in pots just saves you time. And also, if you're like us and you have planters that maybe are not as we get a lot of high school students, college students in the summer helping plant for us, and sometimes they don't have a lot of experience with what is a weed and what isn't a weed. So the fewer weed seeds we have in our starting seed, the less they have to know, which maybe it's not good for them, but it makes things easier for us. Another way you can clean seed at home is just a box fan. It tends to be a pretty good way. If you can get your seed down to a point where it's not too dirty, drop it in front of a box fan, the wind will blow it out, scatter it out, and you can kind of find an area where your best seed is. It's kind of and the angle of the fan, sometimes you have to mess with and stuff, but it's actually a pretty effective way for home cleaning. Works well. Once you get your seed clean, storing it in a good place is always important. If you just throw it into your garage in the middle of the summer, waiting for things to get cool and waiting for it for the time to plant, seed can get too hot, it can get too moist, and so there's a kind of a general rule of thumb. It's called the 100 rule, which means that kind of like your moisture percentage compared to your temperature shouldn't exceed 100. So if you've got like 40% humidity, in your seed, which, it's hard to tell what humidity is in your seed, but it's just kind of a way to think about it. You need it to be 60, no more than 60 degrees. Hopefully you don't have 40% humidity in seed. It really needs to dry down to 15% or so before you can think about putting it in storage, putting in a bucket or something like that. All of our seed, is in air conditioned areas, and also we have dehumidifiers in the room also, which we keep at about 40% or so. But storage of seed is important. The better you store your seed, the better germination you're going to have. So once you got your seed, each seed has a little bit different, things that each seed needs. Some seeds need, well, I'll talk about that later. So there's several books. These are a few of the books that when I first started learning, I read. I know some of these, like growing Harry Phillips, growing and propagating wildflowers. I know you can get on the Grow Native website. A few of these woody plant seed manual is a great one for the U.S. Ag Department. Put it out lots of years ago, but it's still really good for woodies. It gives you all kind of the specific information. And a few of the others we use these are all kind of general information things. For most people, they're going to work great. If you want to get into a little more, forced germination, where you need something to germinate right now. There's lots of online nowadays. You can get lots of information online. This is. Wow, I thought I turned that off. Sorry about that. This is one that probably has more information than most of you want to know, but it's one I was just, a coworker shared it with me, Marcus at work, and it's got lots of information, lots of species. You can see 2,500 species that they've worked with. If you want a little bit of light reading, that's a good one. Okay, let's think about, what does seed need? Why do I need to look at these books? What is it going to help me think about? One thing is stratification. What is stratification and scarification? Stratification is really, so in those books, it's going to say you need to stratify this seed for 15 to 20 weeks before it'll germinate. And different seeds, some seeds don't need much stratification at all, or scarification. Those are seeds like pinto beans, don't need any stratification or scarification. You stick them in the ground, they get wet, they'll germinate. Most native seed has strategies because it doesn't want to fall on the ground in the middle of the summer, germinate, and then be in a drought. So it has these built-in mechanisms like tannins, hard seed coats, resins, oils that keep moisture out, keep other pathogens out, and make the seed last a long time so that when that perfect window comes around, it can germinate. And maybe that is 5 years down, or like a lot of strategies of seeds, like, you know, if you build up enough seed in the area, even if only a, you know, fraction of the percent germinates, it's going to sit there a long time. And if something goes wrong, you know, you'll continue to, with the environment, you know, you know, herd of bison come through and trash the area. You have all this seed that's going to come up later. Stratification is the kind of the trying to replicate the natural process of seed getting stuck in the soil, going through moist and dry periods and freezing and thawing periods. And it's the kind of the human way of making that happen so that it's a little more precise. We have a little more control over it. And that's where we talk about putting things in the refrigerator and freezing and thawing, or putting them outside so they can get those that period where nature helps to break down some of these internal mechanisms that the seed have that keep it from germinating. Scarification is just a simple idea of that, like if you have a really hard seed coat, if you scratch it a little bit, you know, allows moisture to get in and starts the germination process. Some extreme scarification things that we do are things like Kentucky coffee tree will literally take a grinder and cut through that outer seed, and they'll germinate very quickly. Once you do that, if you don't, they can sit there for years before they naturally break down. And if you're, you know, if you got the time, sitting them out in a bucket for lots of years is fine, and you know, you can have good success. But if you're trying to make things happen more quickly, scarification is a way to make it happen faster. The other is light requirements. Some seeds need light to help break things down or to help stimulate the germination. I kind of like to know each one is a lot. Its requirements. So I have some ideas that we'll talk about that kind of just like make it so seeds, if they do need light requirements, can get them. And will, you know, some seeds can get buried very deep and still germinate. A lot of seed, once it gets buried very deep, it will not germinate. So it's something you need to be thinking about as you're getting ready to germinate your seed. Temperature requirements. Again, it's something you need to think about. Some seeds need warm and cold and then warm to germinate, especially a lot of your trees have to go through multiple years. You can trick it. And other seed, you know, won't germinate until soil temperatures reach a certain threshold. Prairie drop seed usually doesn't germinate till midsummer, along with American beautyberry, one of the last germinators. This year, it germinated incredibly late, like 3 weeks later than normal. And that wasn't just us, other producers that we you know, talked to, it didn't germinate for them this year when it usually does either. Interesting thing, no one knows quite what was going on, but it could be the seed, could be the year. It's hard to say. And moisture requirements. You know, of course, seed needs moisture to germinate. The length of time that it gets varies with each seed. Some seeds, if they stay too wet too long, will have problems. You'll have rotting problems. And if some seeds don't stay wet long enough, they'll never germinate. Okay, some of the strategies for doing this. One that I hear that a lot of home people, I mean, it's one that's in the kind of one strategy is to put things in Ziploc bags with moist soil. It's a very space effective way. You know, you can put a lot of seeds in the refrigerator and bring them out and plant them when you need. There are some drawbacks to it. Keeping seed too moist can be a drawback a little bit, or not moist enough, but those are things that you can usually control. One of the bigger problems is that seeds do germinate in the fridge on a fairly regular basis. If they have enough moisture and if the seed, if the germ starts to get activated, it will germinate, start putting roots out. And once it happens, especially, it's hard to get the seed to survive because it never happens at the right time where you can just go lay it out, and usually don't find it until after it's already happened and it started rotting. But if you do things in the fridge, that is one thing you need to really be paying attention to them, especially after they've been in there for a couple months. You'll start to see things that might germinate. One of our strategies is we have these mouse boxes. We call them mouse boxes because, again, we're always conscious of mice. And we put stuff out starting. So we usually use these for things that have to sit out for a long time. So plants that we've planted in the middle of the summer, or that have to be out for multiple years or need a warm treatment, then a cold, then warm. We'll put in the mouse boxes because we know they're going to be outside for a long time. Keeps the mice off, but you have to have a lot of space for that. So that's kind of a negative about it, but they work very effectively. A lot of our phloxes, if you grow phloxes, you'll find that you have better germination if you can plant the phlox immediately, not let the seed dry out. We use those a lot for the phloxes and a lot of our trees. Another strategy for getting seed out is on the left here, that's our ephemeral bed. So ephemerals are plants that come up for short periods of time in the spring and then go dormant. And lots of times you have to grow them for a couple of years before you can transplant them out. And so, or the seed has to sit there with like the yellow bellwort, this little plant here. Seed can sit there for years before it germinates. We've never taken the time to try to force it to germinate. We've found that the easiest way is just throw it in a bed and let it sit there until it does it on its own. But because of that, we have this bed that we can just keep adding seed to. If you don't have, here in a minute, we'll talk about some other a little bit, well, using refrigerators. But if you don't have a refrigerator, just leaving your seed out during the winter is a good strategy. Again, you have to think about squirrels and mice. But because we don't have enough room lots of times in our fridge or in other places, we do leave seed out. Or if seed hasn't germinated one year and we need to leave it out another year, we'll put screen over the top. It does a pretty good job of keeping squirrels and mice. This time of year, it's the squirrels. Squirrels will just love open dirt like that. I mean, they don't even have to have a reason to dig in. They'll just do it this time of year. This on the right is dwarf crested iris. Dwarf crested iris, we have found collecting the seed is always a trick. It gets ready at different times and then all of a sudden it's all gone. So we tend to collect it, just as the first seeds start to disappear, we'll just collect everything, because unless you just are going back every day, you don't get much seed. And if we're traveling down to, the boot hill or something to get seed, we just collect what we can. And if you have a pod that maybe isn't all the way finished, maturing, we found you can sometimes put these pods just on the dirt, let them mature, keep them, moist, kind of like they would in nature, let all the seed fall out, and then just clean up all the debris afterwards. It's a good strategy for collecting seed a little early. And there's some things like Queen of the Prairie, we also do that with. We'll cut the head off, just lay it on soil, allow the seed to come out by itself, because if you've ever seen the seed of Queen of the Prairie, I'm still not 100% sure what the seed actually is. It's a tiny seed inside of a tiny pod, and it's that way we don't have to really like try to figure it out. We just let nature take care of it. Ooh, I'm short on time. I gotta keep going here. Okay, when you're getting ready to plant your seed, your soil is important. On the right, we have a peat-based small particle mix. When you're planting small seeds, you really need a small particle mix. In the middle, we have our general soil that we use in our pots. We also use it for germination. And on the left, we have soil that has limestone in it. So limestone, we found, works really well in glade plants. For years, we had trouble like keeping plants really healthy, like Missouri primrose, purple beard tongue, very dry glade, almost exclusively on limestone glades. You know, we get them to germinate in the pot and to kind of grow, but growing, like we'd lose them during the winter, we'd have fungal problems, all sorts of weird things would happen. We eventually were like, okay, well, let's just try to throw some limestone in the pot. Lo and behold, that's what it needed. And now they're one of the easiest things to grow. Once you get them to start, you know, just they grow really easy, and you almost never have to water them. The only problem now is they get too big. Got to get them out of the pot before you get them sold before they get too big in the pots. So let's talk about the process. So we've talked about all these things that our seed needs. I showed you like the different things you put them into, but the actual putting them into the container, this also is true even if you're direct seeding into pots that you're wanting to grow, as opposed to transplanting. I've kind of talked about transplanting, or I will here, but you know, there are certain species that you can put straight into a pot, and you don't have to worry about the process of moving it from one container into another and transplanting it. The two things we need to think about on the left here, size of seed is really important. So on the left, the upper left, we have Echinacea paradoxa, yellow coneflower. It's a bigger seed. I know by reading those books that it needs a very long stratification period. So it's going to be something it'd be one of our first things I'd plant in the fall, because I want it to sit there for a couple months before it'll be ready to germinate. It's a bigger seed, so I will put that down on top of our regular soil mix, and then later put some of that smaller mix with the peat over the top. The peat has it holds moisture a little better than our large particle mix, so putting it over gives it I don't have to worry about watering as often. Kind of creates a wetter area on top of the seed, where if I just had our soil mix over the top, our soil mix, which we like it to be a well-drained soil. It's why we use a larger particled soil. But to get it to germinate, we'll use the smaller particled soils just to hold moisture better. On the bottom, I have Penstemon digitalis, a very small seed. Again, when I am putting soil on top, I'm not going to plant it very deep. We talked about some seeds needing light. A thin layer of this mix, no more than 1/8 of an inch over the top, maybe a little bit deeper on Baptisia or something you want to keep extremely wet. Sunlight and ultraviolet light and radiant heat can get through that thin layer of soil. And if the seed does need light to trigger certain things, it'll still be able to get it with that. If you're using a small seed, if you put that into this upper, this middle soil here that's got large particles, the seed can fall down into cracks and it may never germinate. It'd be too deep. And with small seeds, most of the time you're gonna have very small seed leaves coming out, and they can't push the soil up or to get out like a echinacea can. In fact, if you plant echinacea too thickly, it'll lift the whole upper layer of soil in a sheet as it germinates. So in that case, you would put your small particle soil down first and then sprinkle your seed on top. After we do this, we'll lay these flats in some water to really soak up some moisture, and then we put saran wrap over the top. That keeps mice out, it keeps insects out. It creates a moisture barrier that is very constant. That way it can sit outside, it can sit in a refrigerator, it can sit wherever it needs to throughout the winter. And we don't have to water it. We don't have to take as much care of it. If we get a big heavy rain, if it's sitting outside, we don't have to worry about the soil all getting splashed out and stuff like that. The only thing you got to worry about is keeping an eye on it and making sure as soon as you see anything to germinate, you pull off the plastic. Once we put them in those things, we either put them outside like I was showing you earlier. This is a little greenhouse that we have that is just our germination greenhouse. When we first bring things out of this walk-in cooler here, it goes into here, and it's a little more. I have sprinkler systems, misters in there, so I can keep the moisture very steady. If you're not using that, you do have to think about, I need to probably water this every day until I get germination. So moisture, again, is super important, of course, for plants, and especially for plants that need long-term, that have a high dormancy, keeping that moisture until all the tannins wash out, until it's ready to germinate, is important. And again, after it germinates, you have to keep it moist too. This is the walk-in cooler. This gives us, once we got this, we really changed how we do things. You have a lot more control over when something comes out. And so, that's for bigger producers. If somebody wants to ask me about that later, there's a cool little CoolBot, it's called, makes your air conditioner turn into a freezer. I can answer that question. Once it germinates, you have to think about what I need to do with it. Some things can be planted, fairly quickly. This is the calero, this is the poppy mallows. These trays, can get planted quickly. It has a large root. You can pretty much plant them as soon as you see the seed leaves. The bottle gentian, we typically don't plant until the second year, as very small roots that are easily damaged, and a very tiny crown that if you try to transplant it when it's small, it's very hard. So thinking about root size is really important. I wanted to throw this in just because this is an interesting thing. We planted this in the winter of 2021, and we planted this immediately after we collected the seed this spring. They both germinated at about the same time. You can see here, some of those germinated early in the spring. But this, we planted this 6/27/22 just a few days after we collected the seed. About 2 weeks later, we started seeing some germination, and we thought this was a failure, but that's why we tried this. It was like, we didn't get much to germinate. Let's see if we can immediately plant seed and get to germinate. The seed that we planted in the winter actually started germinating a little bit after the seed that we had planted the same year. So once you got your seed that is germinated, you have to figure out, when do I want to plant? A few rules of thumb. If it's a large seed, or a seed that has a taproot, planting earlier is definitely easier. The longer you let if you're transplanting, the longer you let a plant develop a root system, the harder it is to switch that root system over into a new place. So if you can plant it early, do. We, of course, keep flats for years because sometimes we'll run out of something and we have an old flat sitting around and we have to divide it up and break up roots and stuff like that. And I'll talk about what you can do if you have to do that later. Other plants, small seeded plants often need to sit around. So this is like lobelia, if you know about lobelia seeds. They're tiny. When they germinate, it's hard to see them. Sometimes it just looks like a green mist kind of growing on top of the soil. You have to let them get pretty good root systems before they transplant well. And then whenever you have a bigger root system, you know, you might not have to keep it as wet, which is one thing because it does have a root system that is established, but it does make the transfer a little harder. Root problems when transplanting. So depth is always a problem. Not getting your plant deeper than it was when it germinated. One of the things that we find at the nursery that happens very often is, so we've made a hole. Let's imagine we've made a hole. We're going to put our plant in there and we push the dirt back over it. If you don't make sure that the dirt gets pushed at the bottom of your pot, if you've got a hole that goes down that far, which you kind of need because you don't want your root all crumpled up either. You need your root to be as elongated as you can. So putting a long, deep hole is good, but you also have to make sure that that soil is completely shut underneath it. Multiple things can happen. If you have a hole, let's say you water it really well, this soil collapses and your plant falls down too deep, and then your crown is too close to the soil and your stem has rotting problems and stuff like that. If it doesn't fill up at all, your roots can come down, hit an air pocket and just not develop very well. Especially with trees, I find all the time when we've had somebody plant and there's like large die-offs, I'll start to like pull on plants and realize there were big holes underneath, and you can literally just pull the plant out of the pot and there's no root development because it was kind of sitting in an open space, even though it looked nice on the top with soil nicely placed around the stem, looked like it should do fine. When you pull it, it's like, whoop, that never had a chance. The root just dried out within the pot. This is Abby, one of our longtime, started as a high school student. Now she's in college studying biology. She still comes out and plants during the summer for us. One thing that we do, we wet our soil first. If you put a rooted plant that comes out of a tray into really dry dirt, it doesn't take long for those roots to die. So think about your hole, think about getting the roots back in. And one of the reason for that is what we call transpiration. When this is the process of plants creating energy, releasing their it's the way that plants regulate their temperature when all these chemical processes are happening in it, and help to create draw to pull up moisture from the soil. This osmotic force, like through cellular osmotic force, that pulls a higher moisture area up into a lower moisture area. That process, you have to think about it as you're planting. So let's imagine this is sitting in my tray, I've pulled it up, it's lost all of its moisture, and it's these are little raindrops, like that represents moisture in the soil. And if it's a hot day, this plant immediately it's losing moisture out of these roots. I mean, out of these stoma, these guard cells. The stoma are like little holes that are in the leaf that allow moisture to come out. Dependent on there's light that stimulates the stoma. There's it's a pretty complicated process, but the stoma can be activated by multiple climate variabilities. So if I've pulled this out, let's say I've got a pretty big leaf, but I don't have much root, one strategy is to go ahead and just cut the leaves back. It reduces the amount of area that the plant's going to be losing moisture. This plant I've drawn, like we've pulled it out, and that top root starting to, that top leaf starting to die. That happens naturally, and the plant will kind of make that happen. But if you can cut some leaves back so that doesn't happen, it saves time, because if you think about a plant has to die back fairly quickly, but then it's lost some energy in the process, and also rotted leaf can attract funguses and all that kind of things. So after you've got it planted, let's talk about some of our major pests. Thrips are just something you need to be watching out for. It's not an easily controlled thing, but something you need to think for. Coreopsises have a coreopsis beetle that eats them. This is a picture of a coreopsis on the left that the beetles have completely decimated. It's easily taken care of. It doesn't last very long throughout the season. Neem oils in general can kill them fairly easily. Lobelias have a moth that will girdle the root system and kill it. It's one that you have to watch out. It's one of the few pests that actually can, well, that and the coreopsis beetle can completely decimate whole plants. It doesn't just harm them, the whole plant would just die. Columbines has some leaf miners. Sawflies can lay larvae in it, and it will also kill columbine. And then in the late summer, your blister beetles, they're kind of a general nuisance. They will eat plants all the way back. Typically don't kill them all the way. They don't look good. So it's another easy one you can use oils to kill them. But just think about your pests. Some of the natural pest controls, of course, everybody knows on your milkweeds that you have aphids. Aphids are one of the favorite things for aphid laying parasitic wasps. They lay their eggs. So these are the yellow ones are the oleander aphids. All these brown ones are aphids that wasp. I don't know if it's actually this wasp, but there's multiple species of parasitic wasps, but just lay their eggs within within the aphid, and those now have become the egg for the wasp larva. One of our favorite pests, monarchs. You don't think of it as pests, but if you're trying to grow milkweeds, they can eat a lot of milkweeds, a lot of baby milkweeds. You have to have a strategy. We have a lot of common milkweed that grows around our nursery, and we'll take our larvae, the caterpillars, and move them over to those common milkweeds as we need. Pipevine swallowtails, this is our pipevine cage. Pipevine is one of it really is a pest. It's hard to grow. Pipevine swallowtails will lay multiple eggs on a single plant, and they can eat a plant very quickly once they've all hatched. So we try to just keep the pipevine swallowtail from laying eggs on our plants. It doesn't always work. We've seen butterflies crawl underneath. They'll be just, somehow they know they're in there, and they'll just be swarming around this, bouncing into it, trying to get down there. It's amazing. It's kind of amazing to think that they're actually smelling something, or that's down there, some tiny little thing that's actually quite far away from them. Once you got your plants to grow. Dormancy is something that happens that people aren't aware of sometimes. I've had multiple people say, you know, my milkweed came up, it started to grow, and that all died. Milkweeds are really good at going dormant when they're not having the right conditions. Lots of times you'll find if you dig down, the roots are still there. Give it time, it'll come back. Royal catchfly, especially the first year, will go dormant and come back multiple times. Of course, bluebells, you'll go dormant soon after they come up. You got to, if you are trying to grow bluebells, the earlier you can get them planted, the better. Wheat's with the very first thing that we try to get going, because the longer period of time, you know, once it gets hot, they quit growing. So you gotta start them early. Of course, more fun stuff. When you have a big plant in a small pot, you got to give it a lot of water. If you cut things back, it keeps things easier to deal with. Weeding is always something you got to think about. Of course, your end goal is you're expanding these, you know, you're printing these beautiful plants that come from these small remnant prairies and remnant forest areas, and we're expanding their range for our own benefit and for the benefit of nature, and therefore for the benefit of everybody else, really, if you whether they know it or not. You know, this is an MPF, Missouri Prairie Foundation prairie, is Golden Prairie. A lot of our plants come from these prairies. And of course, what we're looking for is seed. You know, this is a huge area of slender mountain mint. If you think about the millions and millions and millions of seed here that gets collected and then spread out across Missouri and the Midwest, it is the biggest. You know, humans are the biggest spreaders of native plants now. The natural processes, this is confined to a small area in a agricultural, you know, completely surrounded by agriculture. It's not going to move without our help. And then we, of course, make our own landscapes with these plants. And that's I guess that's the end. That's, you know, that's why we do it in the first place, because we want this beauty and something that makes us feel connected to the bigger world, and something that we like to show off to. All right, I hope that wasn't too much and too fast. I think that's been over an hour, so I'm sorry. I think I'm ready for questions.
Mike, that was fantastic. This is Carol David. I'm the director of the Missouri Prairie Foundation and the Grow Native program. Mike, it's you have phenomenal knowledge that you've gained over so many years, and growing every step of the way is fraught with so many things that could go wrong. And you've, you know, through all these years, you've learned what can go wrong and how to correct it. And that knowledge is so valuable to all of us and to the native plant industry. So thank you for being so generous with your knowledge. We do have many questions. Yeah. And so I'll get through as many of them as I can. So first, some questions are pretty detailed and quick, and others are more ambiguous. Christine asks, I'm needing a 1/8 inch hardware screen for separating seeds, but not able to find one. Do you know of any sources?
I mean, hardware screen is like being at the store at the right time. There are some online places, but you usually have to buy them in fairly large amounts. And so it's kind of frustrating. I for years, we have some tumbling screens, and it's always like, am I at the right hardware store at the right time to get the right screen? And I don't have a great answer, except for just keep looking at our, you know, for them. It's getting small amounts is a hard problem. Yeah, I don't have a great answer.
Thank you. Greg asks how I understand cleaning, but God doesn't clean his seeds. In other words, they're not cleaned in nature. How important is cleaning seeds? And are there some times when you wouldn't need to clean them?
So, you don't, if you're a home, like on some of those things where we'll literally just cut the plant off and put them in a flat and let them do it on their own. If you're at a home grower, that works fine. There's no real reason. You do need to realize that depending on the year and how much how well that plant grew, there might not be a whole lot of seed that's good in that pod or in that head or whatever. And so you are taking you just don't know exactly where you are. On a commercial end, it's better to know what you're starting with. So cleaning is much more important on that commercial end. And if you're putting stuff out in a field, just taking the time to go and throwing out, you're going to have pretty good success that way too. Nature does break things down. Of course, lots of what nature does is uses animals to come spread stuff around. So you've got to realize that animals might be part of that process and they might get to eat a lot of it as they're doing it. But yeah, in general, it's not something that you have to do. It's just to scale things up. It's important.
Thank you. Amy asks, can you elaborate on how to clean seeds with a box fan? I'm curious how it doesn't make the seeds blow everywhere and get lost.
Yeah, so that's kind of like what I was talking about, the angle of the box fan. If you can lean a box fan back a little bit, you create a column of air kind of coming up, but then underneath that is an empty space. So you take your seed, you get it broken up into, as much as you can. You can't just drop whole heads through. That's not going to do much for you. But you break the seed up, try to take any of the fluffy stuff off, and then don't stand right next to the box fan. Stand away from it where you can kind of feel that there's some wind blowing. You're kind of trying to replicate. If you ever seen, like in the old days where like you see people cleaning wheat and they're just letting wind blow the chaff off the wheat. I don't know if you can watch. I remember watching like old nature videos, of primitive, cultures or primitive cultures, cleaning their wheat or grains, and letting the wind do it. You're trying to just kind of create those same conditions. So don't be right next to the box fan. Get away so you can feel some breeze. But then as that seed falls through that column of air, it will spread things out. You don't want it, like you said, you really don't want the air blowing right on the ground, because then a lot of times your seed falls and the air continues to just blow it away, from where you are. So you need it to fall through the column and then an open space at the bottom. That's how it works the best.
Thank you. We have a couple questions about, you're drying the seeds out, but then you're putting them in bags and keeping them moist. So maybe you could just kind of go through this a little bit. So I'll just tell you a couple of questions that are related, and maybe you can answer with one answer for both of them. So one question, if seed is dried, is it okay to store it in the refrigerator in a sealed container? I think she means dried. But then there's another question, should we keep the seeds in brown bags or concealed containers? I thought we had to keep the seeds in brown bags so they can breathe. So we kind of have two things going on, the drying phase and then the stratification phase. Could you answer those questions so that makes sense?
It is. It's a complicated question just because every seed needs something different. So let's just talk about a generalization. So a lot of your forest species. So if you're out collecting like celandine poppy, we saw that early picture of the celandine poppy. There are some seeds that really never want to be dry. And it tends to be those early blooming forest seeds. So celandine poppy, this can get really complicated. How do I get this? Okay. So we are really asking two questions. So the drying of seed is really, if you have a plant that has grown in the middle of the summer, it has those mechanisms, so it's not going to germinate till spring. So in order to keep that seed until you're ready to use it, you need to let it dry out. You don't want to immediately take like a coneflower that got ready in the middle of the summer and stick it into a plastic bag so it will germinate, because it's going to be ready to germinate sometime in December, and you can't do anything with it. Like I talked about, seeds that will germinate within a bag or rot if they're in that bag too long. So you got to plant things. In those books, it will tell you like this plant needs 4 to 6 weeks of stratification. So you got to kind of plan, okay, 4 weeks out from that is at this time, I want these seeds to kind of be ready to, plant sometime in early April. So there is you got to figure these things out ahead of time. But in order to keep that seed stable so that at that time you're ready to plant it, you need to dry it and get it to this point where it sits, where if most man, this is getting too long, but most if you think about a seed, it's sitting on its plant and flopping around, and in the summer if it falls off, it's mostly going to be dry. It's not going to stay wet. And if it does stay wet, lots of times it can rot. So keeping it moist is for the stratification, that it needs, not for keeping it, except in those cases where forest plants, many of them need to stay moist to survive. But you kind of have to learn those things, and it's that read those books. It'll give you those specific plants that they can't get dried. I hope that isn't too convoluted.
Thank you, Mike. And it's a question about where you collect seed. Do you collect just there at the nursery? Do you visit native, intact, natural communities, or do you purchase seed, or all of these options? And before you answer, though, I just wanted to remind everyone that if you ever wanted to collect seed on private property, you would always want to ask permission first, and that includes the prairies that the Missouri Prairie Foundation owns. And for collecting seed on any public land, the rules can be different depending on your purpose. So you would always want to check with the public land manager before collecting. So I just wanted to get my disclaimer in there. And then Mike, if you want to talk about where you collect and how.
Yeah, so we collect everywhere. Our first choice, of course, is prairies and good intact wild areas. So MPF, MDC have bidding processes where you bid on prairies. Highest bidder gets the rights to the prairie. So we collect off those. We also, if we see something on a roadside or in somebody's field, we try to figure out who owns that field, and ask them. So we are dealing with farmers that like years ago that Mervyn, made contact with, and we've been collecting off their little plots of remnant prairies. We have production areas that we also grow a lot of our seed in production areas. But that seed, originally has to come from these prairies. And whenever we can get back to a prairie and get that original source, it's always very important to us. Our last resource is getting it from ourselves. We do have some things planted at the nursery that we'll have to travel that are very hard to collect or hard to find. We are growing some of our own things in pots, community, like larger pots, just because they're very rare or very hard to get to at the time that you need to get them. So yeah, we're doing everything. You'll see us walking along highways lots of times, because highways actually are a good source. But you do, yeah, and there's different rules for different places, so you got to be aware of those kinds of things.
Thanks, Mike. And I just wanted to add also that in regard to the bidding process that the Missouri Prairie Foundation has, and probably other landowners have who have bidding processes, is that we have really strict criteria for how the seed is collected and when and how much. We even require that seed collectors use an air pressure hose to blow off their any kind of equipment before entering our prairies to make sure there aren't any weed seeds. And, Mike's comments underscore how important it is to protect these original remnant prairies and other natural communities, and also to keep to have them managed well so they don't have invasive plants on them, and that takes money. And so we really appreciate everyone who financially supports the Prairie Foundation and supports other organizations that are protecting these natural communities and these plant resources, because these remnants are so critically important to the native plant industry. We have a couple questions here or comments about the milk jug method. What do you think about the milk jug method for the private gardener? You cut the milk jug in half, fill the lower part with soil, add seeds, and have more moist microclimate and a little warmth in spring.
Yeah, I mean, for the home gardener, that should be good. I would definitely, if I was doing that, put a hole in the bottom so it drains well. You get a big rain or something, it'll fill up with water, kill everything. But yeah, I mean, so all those processes where I was talking about, like putting your soil in, putting the smaller particled soil, those are things you could add to that milk jug process. Because thinking about seed size is really important. Mini soils, they can stay too wet or too dry. So if you can get a well-drained soil and then a smaller soil on top, we've found. The other thing about peat, I had wanted to say this, but it was getting too long. One thing about peat that can also be a problem is we tend to have, whenever you have a soil that holds moisture better, we tend to have more weed problems, and we have problems with things like liverwort and mosses growing in the pots. So, that's another thing you need to be thinking about when you're choosing your soils that you are going to put in there. But that process works fine. Yeah, good way to do it.
Thank you. Question, when you put saran wrap over your germination trays, do you poke holes in the saran wrap, or is this not necessary?
No, in fact, I mean, part of it's a little scary for the novice, because like we will put saran wrap. That's really to just keep that moisture level very consistent. Again, you really need to soak that tray. You don't want it like just dripping water, but we'll soak those trays so that soil is fairly saturated. And then you put the saran wrap, and we don't really want moisture to leave that until we start seeing the germination happen, and then we'll open it up. Sometimes you'll see molds starting to grow, like especially if you have seed particles that are sitting on top. Funguses will be in those, and molds, and you'll start seeing that. It's not something we've ever really found was a problem. But the most important thing is, when you are doing that, you really got to pay attention, because as soon as things germinate, if you get a hot day and that plastic's on the top, it'll cook things. But like our calorows now, because they're such a long, they take so much time to germinate, and we're always looking for more space to put stuff. We'll put the saran wrap on those, put them outside. And then once the temperatures start hitting, once we start seeing any germination start to happen, we pull the plastic off. But it's really good for keeping out the mice and keeping the soil intact. And but no, I wouldn't put holes in it. There'd be no way to get water back into it without like unfolding it, if you were doing that.
And do you, for the trays that you cover with plastic, do the trays have drain holes in the bottom?
Well, no, I mean, we completely wrap the entire thing in plastic. So the plastic's going underneath the flat and then going over the top, and we fold it in. I mean, once it germinates, yeah, you definitely take that off, and there's drain holes in the flats for sure. Yeah.
Um, it was pointed out that peat is a non-renewable resource. Is there other things that could be used instead?
Yeah, we were supposed to do a little experiment this year with a company, and we never got the. We're looking at using some other things, smaller particled stuff. We haven't gotten that done. We talked about it. I don't know that it's the peat. The main thing that we're really looking for is particle size. So if you can find something that has a smaller particle, but also allows for some drainage. So if you're using a smaller particle with some perlite or something that kind of makes it so it isn't going to just become a mucky mess, I think that is our goal. We didn't get it done this year. And again, I mean, we are trying to use as little as we can. So we are only putting like just a dusting on top of our pots. But yeah, I mean, peat is always something we try to stay away from as best we can.
There's a question, and I think the answer is, I'm not sure that such a list exists, but Mary asks, is it possible to put a list of all the resources on how to germinate each plant in a follow-up email? I don't know that there is a list of resources for every plant native to Missouri. We have some information on our website, and I shared that in the chat. Then we will include that link in our follow-up email. And then Mike mentioned those books. But Mike, you want to comment on this more?
Yeah, I mean, it's those books are good. One thing, Shaw Nature Reserve used to have a really good thing on their website. I don't think it exists anymore. Of course,
Jen posted that propagation.
Oh, did she?
Publication, and we'll include that in the chat as
Oh,
well.
okay. Yeah. I've been looking for that and wasn't able to find it. So yeah, that we've always used that. I mean, it's there's so many plants out there, especially in Missouri. We've got the most. But for all your basics, you can really find them in those books. Grow Native has a list, for most of your basic plants. The forest species are a little harder to find. So that's a little more of a challenge, but those books have most of those forest species in them too.
Thank you. There was a question about, can you suggest some sort of perennials to recommend for a beginner to try out collecting and stratifying, some that are, fairly foolproof?
Yeah, so I mean, your echinaceas, purple cone flowers, it's very easy to germinate. It doesn't take a long stratification. It's a big seed, so you're not like trying to figure out the harder part of purple cone flower is getting it before the birds. So you kind of have to watch. Again, like I had said, when you start to see the stem turn black, starting to turn a little black, you can collect it. And usually that's a sign that there's no more nutrients going up into that seed, for it to finish off, and that's a good time to collect. And then that's an easy one. Some of the smaller, like penstemons, easy. Your monardas are pretty easy. Now those are smaller seeds, so you kind of have to be aware that you need to put those onto that smaller particled mix. You got to be aware that you don't want your seed to be so small that it falls down through holes. That's on those smaller seeds. That's what you got to think about. But those are easy to germinate. They're easy to transplant. your baptisias are pretty easy to transplant too. They're a little harder to germinate, but not, you can get, even with very little work, you can get some of them to germinate. And I didn't talk about, it was another thing I skipped over. So about dormancy in plants, it's another complicated thing, but you can almost, anytime you plant plant seeds, you can probably get some of them to germinate. Some of them might have to sit there longer, but you can usually get some of them to germinate. But the echinacea, or the purple cone flower, the foxglove beard tongue, and the Monarda fistulosa are all very easy on all sides. Easy to transplant, easy to germinate, easy to grow.
I would just like to add too that, when consumers, and we're all probably consumers of native plants that we buy, you can see the incredible amount of work that's involved. So when when we're paying for those plants, we're paying for this expertise and all of the painstaking work to collect seed and clean them and stratify them. So just something to think about when we're buying plants, and so important to support the industry. A few more questions if you still have time, Mike. Question, is it difficult to source limestone for soil? You had mentioned with those glade plants that you were adding some limestone.
Right, so that is what we, it was kind of an experiment. You can actually buy small particle limestone at most, it's kind of a lime, garden centers, there's like a lime, it's for pH in your soil. They sell it bagged. Now what we use is literally just we get a semi or a dump truck that comes and dumps. It's called chat. It's kind of the leftover stuff when they're screening, screening road rock and stuff. It's the very fine particles that are left over. We get that from the local quarry in large, in dump truck amounts. But they do sell limestone additives that you can put in your garden and stuff like that at garden centers also.
Thank you. Specific question about heuchera. How to treat heuchera seeds to get them to germinate?
Yeah, so heuchera it's an amazing plant. Is the way it grows. It's such a tiny seed, just like one of the smallest seeds there are. Again, I think it's one of those that you really have to be careful about what you're planting them onto. If you've ever seen a heuchera germinate, they make like teeny tiny little leaves to start out with, and if that seed's very deep, it won't germinate well. It's like it'll just sit there, and because it's not going to be able to get up into the sunshine to germinate. To grow. So putting down a good layer of very small particled peat or whatever, or we don't really use straight peat. Ours is a germination mix, actually, is what it's called, which is it's a mix of peat and perlite and some pine, some compost, and it's a mix that we buy. But that's getting that first, and then heuchera actually will germinate. It's one of the things that we can plant in the middle of the summer with seed from the previous year that will germinate, kind of whenever we keep it wet long enough. And then it's amazing too. You can actually transplant it as just a tiny little plant, and it tends to transplant very easily. The bigger trick is getting it to germinate, and it's keeping a consistent moisture to it, and not putting it in such a large particle mix that your seeds are falling down into it. I think that's the harder part.
Thank you. There was just a question about when registrants will receive a link to rewatch, and Erica will be sending out an email tomorrow with a link to the recording. And a few other questions, if you have just a few more minutes. Linda says, I start seeds inside and frequently get a white mold. Is this a factor of air circulation?
Yeah. And again, it tends, we get that too, especially when we put things in that saran wrap. We've never found that it's really caused, any long-term problems with the plants. It doesn't seem like it's killing seed for the most part. I'm not sure, lots of times it does kind of happen with around particles that are in the seed. But I've never found it in such a amount that it was a real problem. Now, I think if you are, having so much that you're seeing that it's damaging things, it is definitely about airflow and light. We pull it out of the fridge and we put it in sunlight, that mold will disappear very quickly. It doesn't last but a few hours before those ultraviolet lights will really take care of the mold.
Thank you. Can you use potting soil to germinate over the winter?
Yeah. Just kind of make sure your potting soil, just kind of assess. In soils, there's a few things like whenever you buy soil from a store, sometimes it's very small particles and sometimes it's very large particles, and just kind of when you're buying that soil, if you kind of look at it and saying, wow, it's like, wow, can the seed fall down between this, or is this stuff going to stay so wet that it's going to become a problem over time? If it's a smaller particle seed, like some peat mixes, in order to get seed to germinate, you need to keep it pretty wet. Once that germinates, then you might have the problem of it staying too wet. We actually had a problem with that this year. We had new person planting seed, didn't quite understand what we're asking, and we've got some stuff planted in pure peat moss, some hydrangea, and you've got to keep hydrangeas fairly wet to get them to germinate. But they germinated all right, but then once they germinated, that peat was so wet, it really didn't dry out for weeks, and so you got to keep it's a dilemma. So you got to keep it wet so it germinates, but then they actually, a lot of them rotted out because of that, because it stayed too wet. So I'd say, kind of experiment. Once you'll find a soil that works, stick with it. It's a good, we've used the same soil now. We kind of developed our own soil and then have had a company, produce it for us for decades now, and haven't really changed a whole lot.
Thanks, Mike. Just in the chat, there was a question, somebody had a question about how to find more specific information on scarification of seeds, which need them, and how to do that. And you may have ideas, Mike, but also in the chat, someone put that Prairie Moon Nursery, which is in Wisconsin, has a cultural sheet that was published in 2020 that has lots of natives listed and what they need for germination. So that might be a good resource, as well as the books that Mike mentioned that are in the chat. And we do have some information on the Grow Native Seed page. Also, Rita put in the chat, an excellent book is The Prairie in Seed by Dave Williams. And we have sold this. I think we might be out of it right now. Anything else you want to add, Mike, on scarification?
Yeah, scarification it's a fairly simple process. You're really just trying to put some damage to a hard seed coat. A lot of the books that you're going to read say, use sandpaper, just put some seed in between some sandpaper, scratch it around. That's enough. For larger scale, we have a very old blender that has pretty dull blades on it, and we'll to scarify larger amounts. We will put the seed in that blender, kind of hold it sideways so it's not making peanut butter, and then hit it a few times and let it hit those seeds. You'll break a few seeds, but for larger amounts that works. You might be careful, if it was a brand new one, that very sharp ones, you might be careful about using that, or that's kind of our process.
Thanks. And do you sell the mix that you guys use at the nursery? Do you sell that?
You mean our soil mix?
I think so, yes.
We have not. Yeah, it might be something to think about.
One last question, Linda says she has a small piece of tall grass prairie in the Les Bluffs. I've had the opportunity to harvest flower seed from private ground, spread on my property for a natural stratification process in 2020. It was a good spring, but in general, a dry year. Any opinion on how that will impact my germination process and successful outcome? And this is an interesting question for many people who might seed this winter and it might be dry. Like, I think you were saying, the seed might sit there for some time.
Yeah.
What do you have to do?
So yeah, the weather is always a big factor in how native plantings react. There's not much you can do about it. The things that happen if you do have drier years and things don't germinate as well, long term you tend to have more weed pressures, because if you can get a good germination that first year and really get ground covered, with the seed that you put out there that you want, the other seed that might be there has less of a chance to get going. But if you don't have good germination, it just leaves it open for other things to come in, or for seed that's already there to have a better chance to get started. 2012 was, dry summers are not necessarily as bad of a problem as dry springs, I would say, in general, because once, a lot of these native seeds have a lot of mechanisms for, once they germinate, they can really hang on in some pretty tough conditions, as long as they've gotten to a certain size. But if you don't have a good spring, then your seed has to sit there longer. You have more pest problems. You have, your seed can get covered too deep. There's lots of other things that can happen by letting the seed sit longer. But,
Mike, thank you so much. We're going to need to end it now, but thank you for being so generous with your time and answering all the questions. There are many well-deserved accolades for you in the chat, Mike. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Our next presentation will be our Grow Native Professional Member Conference. This is an in-person conference on November 9, a full-day conference for professional members. The in-person version is for professional members, but anyone can tune in virtually. If you're an NPF dues-paying member, it's free, or $30 for non-members. So we won't have a webinar in 2 weeks. We will have our Grow Native Professional Member Conference, but then we'll have another webinar on wasps on November 23rd. So stay tuned for those things. Do register for the conference. We have a lot of great speakers. And Mike, thank you very much for your expertise and excellent presentation. Have a good night, everyone.
thank you. Thanks for everything you do. Good night.
Thank you, Mike.